presumably fossils of the organisms that produce the organic matter. And after heated polemics and lots of controversy, it all turned out to be earthly contamination, including degraded ragweed pollen masquerading as alien life forms. And because of that bad experience, many scientists today are, just to give them credit, they are very, very cautious. They don't want to be burned again. And as they read these results, the press releases and internet correspondence is full of many very competent people saying, time out, guys, not so fast. Let's examine what you're really talking about. And you should, in fairness to the scientific community, there are many people that are far more cautious than some of the other articles you see that are, Carl Sagan has said this puts, to silence this whole idea of the fall of man and all these absurd, ungodly extrapolations by some. But let's continue. Now, it's possible that some of these paws are indigenous to meteorite. There are many explanations for them that don't require life. Meteorologist John Carriage of UCLA points out that decomposition could certainly produce polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, but there are dozens of other mechanisms that also produce paws. They could have formed from simpler compounds on Mars which have never evolved chemically to living organisms. Now notice all this so far presumes it really did come from Mars. Who knows? It gets more complicated. The NASA researchers reported that golden-colored particles in the meteorite contained chemical and organic particles which suggested bacteria-sized organisms living on Mars 5.6 billion, that's with a B, billion years ago. I'm always impressed with the precision of these estimates. The NASA researchers also found tiny sausage-shaped particles that, these are not just microscopic, they're submicroscopic. They're electron microscope issues you're dealing with here. McKay interpreted them as fossilized microbes because they resemble ancient bacteria found on Earth rocks. Well, I thought this was an Earth rock in the first place, but let's go on. Kenneth Nielsen of the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee points out, quote, none of this can distinguish between biology and chemistry. Nielsen, whose work on bacterial carbonate precipitation is cited by McKay and his colleagues, he notes that warm fluids circulating through the Martian crust might have deposited the same sequence of minerals without any help from organisms. I love this warm fluids thing. You run into that. There are no fluids on Mars. The atmosphere can't hold it. Now, there's a huge mystery on the planet Mars. We'll get into this probably next time. But the planet Mars, if you examine the surface of it, bears evidence of gigantic floods. There's erosion, substantial erosion. The shape of the erosion is very visible from the photography. And yet there's no water because it doesn't have the gravity to hold it. Now, Don Patton has made the interesting observation that over 90% of all the craters on Mars are on the same side. That's kind of interesting. In fact, 82% of them appear, you can argue geometrically, may have all hit in the same hour. That's the only way to explain the mathematics that are involved. And I think it's one of the most simplest way to explain it. One of the possible conjectures is that Mars attracted a comet. Comets are usually made of ice. And when you get to the Roche limit is typically about 2.44 radii of the planet. It's a point at which the tidal forces in the approaching object are so severe it breaks up into pieces. It's called the Roche limit. A small object approaching a planet typically will break up at the Roche limit. That's what happened to the comet that approached Jupiter several years ago. That broke up into some 22 pieces and became known as Shoemaker-Levy. And a couple of years later, when it returned, those pieces, of course, at that time crashed into the planet, making that spectacular display that we talked about a few years back. Now, one of the theories about Mars is that this comet broke up the Roche limit, and the ice landing on the ground may have made the craters, but also melted to become the water that caused the erosion. And Mars, not having enough gravity to hold it, eventually evaporate into space. A reasonable explanation from what we know about the circumstances. There are some other factors that cause some people to conjecture that this short flood on Mars may have occurred at the same time, for some interesting reasons, that the flood on the Earth did in the days of Noah. And it's possible that there's a mathematical relationship between the two, and we'll explore some of that later. But let's move on with this issue here. Jim Papicki, director of the Institute of Meteoritics at the University of New Mexico, has said, quote, we have concluded that from our measurements, give no evidence of life. And he's studying for over a year the 4.5-pound potato-sized meteorite that we're dealing with. It's contained pyrite samples which contain two sulfur isotopes, sulfur-32 and sulfur-34, which the ratio of which changes on Earth in the presence of biological activity. Quote, there's no evidence that it is in the ratio for life forms. In fact, the ratio points in the opposite direction. And he's about to publish his paper in another journal. William Schopf of UCLA, who spent his career separating microfossils of early life on the Earth from imposters, said, I think it's very unlikely they have remnants of biological activity. Now, these microfossils are from 20 to 100 nanometers in length. They're objects that are 100 times smaller than the smallest microfossils of ancient bacteria ever found on the Earth, Schopf points out. 100 nanometers, by the way, to give you a feeling, is about the size of the HIV virus. See, that's what we're dealing with here, if I recall correctly. Anyway, quoting Cornell exobiologist Carl Sagan, of all people, he's made the famous statement, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so Schopf quotes that back to him in rebuttal. Now, the meteorite that you'll see in the press, everyone's talking about, is ALH 84001. It's designated that way because the ALH it was originally found in the Allen Hills region of Antarctica. That's the ALH. 84 is when it was found in 1984, and 001 was the first one logged in that year. It's about 1.9 kilograms. It's about the size of a softball or a potato, whatever you want to call it. And it didn't get any particular scrutiny for over 10 years. Found in 84. Some meteorites are believed by scientists to be chunks of the Moon and the Mars that were blasted into space by large impacts. That always fascinates me because I thought there was an escape velocity very, very high to get out into orbit. But in any case, that is a view held by competent scientists about some things. Minerals in this sample, of this particular sample, were initially written off as a common piece of detritus on the asteroid belt. But in 1994, David Mittelfeld of Lockheed Martin in Houston pointed out subtle similarities to known Martian meteorites, which stimulated further study. Now, these other meteorites that are compared, we don't really know they came from Mars anywhere, but they are regarded from Mars, and this particular thing started to have some chemical similarities to those particular meteorites, which caused people to start taking a second look. Now, this is a quote, just to show you how scientific myth can be packaged as truth. Quote, radiometric dating suggests that ALH 8401 to have congealed from magma to become part of the original Martian crust 4.5 billion years ago, just 100 million years after the planet was formed, making it the oldest rock known from any planet. Still early in Martian history, a meteorite impact shattered the rock, leaving fractures where minerals, including possible traces of life, formed perhaps 3.6 million years ago. Much later, another impact launched the rock into space, where radioactive nuclei created by deep space radiation showed that it wandered for 16 million years before blazing through the Earth's atmosphere and crashing into the Antarctic ice cap. There it lay buried for 13,000 years until scientists found it on the wind-scored ice in Allen Hills region of Antarctica, close quote. Now, you know, an awful lot of people will read that and sort of assume, well, that's scientific, fact. And of course, as you recognize, that's just a whole string of conjectures laid end to end. But one of the questions that's on your mind, I'm sure, is how do we know it's from Mars? Well, NASA reports show that the concentration of xenon, krypton, neon, argon-36, argon-40, nitrogen, and CO2, gas trapped in the interior of the meteorites, almost exactly matches the values obtained by the Viking lander. So it's got some chemical similarities to materials that were picked up on Mars. But in that same NASA report, which you can find on the internet, it also has the following statement, quote, similar collisions of asteroids or comets with Earth could have blasted rocks into escaping orbits that eventually carried them to Mars. Some of these rocks could have been large enough to shield any dormant spores or microbes inside them for millions of years against the sterilizing effects of the solar and cosmic radiation. Some of the rocks could have broken apart when they landed on Mars. This leads to an intriguing speculation. A few billion years ago, when Mars still had water on its surface, could the planet have been seeded by organisms carried in meteorites from the Earth? Interesting if you're going to play that game, it works both ways. What NASA doesn't mention, but I'll just point out, from a solar wind point of view, Mars is downwind. It's more natural for detritus in space in the region of the Earth to be migrated to Mars than coming uphill. Follow me? Just a comment. Now, one major flaw with this whole scenario is that meteorites pick up organic debris. Guys, not so fast. Let's examine what you're really talking about. And you should, in fairness to the scientific community, there are many people that are far more cautious than some of the other articles you see that are, Carl Sagan has said this puts, to silence presumably fossils of the organisms that produce the organic matter. And after heated polemics and lots of controversy, it all turned out to be earthly contamination, including degraded ragweed pollen masquerading as alien life forms. This whole idea of the fall of man and all these absurd, ungodly extrapolations by some. But let's continue. Now, it's possible that some of these paws are indigenous to meteorite. There are many explanations for them that don't require, and because of that bad experience, many scientists today are, just to give them credit, they are very, very cautious. They don't want to be burned again. And as they read these results, the press releases and internet correspondence is full of many very competent people saying, time out their life. Meteorologist John Carriage of UCLA points out that decomposition could certainly produce polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, but there are dozens of other mechanisms that also produce PAHs. They could have formed from simpler compounds on Mars which have never